time and energy, and also whether you have the sense that you're actually making a difference. And I'll start with Aya, if I may.
Hi, Melinda. Maybe I am studying in Belgium, but I am Moroccan. And my country, Morocco, is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, with a growing population that needs to be fed. It's counting on food imports, and this dependency is exacerbated by our changing climate. Moroccans really live on the front line of climate, from our coastline with severe erosions of a rate of 1 meter per year to the south, where the encroaching sands of the Sahara threaten fragile ecosystems and create water scarcity for farmers. As a young person who always felt a bond with nature, since I was young, I was touched by the challenges in the agricultural sector. I saw the opportunity to follow agricultural studies and in this way align my studies with the climate crisis and act according to the preservation of natural resources, while coming up with innovative ideas to the sector of agri-food industries and bio-industries. My studies also brought my attention to the food insecurity and the undernourishment people suffer from because of droughts, floods, water scarcity, which will all be on the rise because of climate change. This is one of the reasons why I joined EAS, the biggest student association in the field of agriculture, because I wanted to meet people who are also passionate about working towards sustainable food systems and exchange ideas. We have ongoing projects across the world, and it's important that we as youth are enabled to make our innovative ideas a reality. It is important that we are able to speak up for ourselves and as students, and we are happy to have Bayer as one of our partners and feel this momentum of youth engagement going on. We are really happy about it.
Aya, may I just ask you, because you said that you felt personally touched by the situation of agriculture in your country. So I wondered, did you have personal connections with farmers that touched you, or was it more of an abstract sense that you felt?
Yeah, well, in EAS, we offer exchange programs. It's internship places where students can go to other countries to learn hard skills. And one of them, the owner is a friend of mine. And because there were no rain, they couldn't have production anymore. So they had to go to the city and leave the rural place to own a living. And we also had to cancel this exchange program place.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. Let me now continue with Nasratullah, if he can hear us. Nasratullah, if you can hear us, I would also very much like to hear from you what drives your dedication of time and energy, and whether you have a feeling that you are making a difference.
Hi, everyone. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with all the distinguished guests and also the audience. Well, I will just shed some light on where I started. So when I started my university, my bachelor's in environmental sciences in 2016, the more I studied, the more I became concerned about environmental issues. And then slowly and gradually, I just got to know that the biggest threat to humanity and the planet is, of course, climate change among the environmental catastrophes. And I really believe that it's an umbrella risk to all other risks facing the world. And even in some researches, it was established that there are linkages between COVID-19 and also the environmental degradation. And some scientists believe that COVID-19 or coronavirus is really a zoonotic disease. And the main motivation that's driving me to fight for climate change is that, firstly, because climate change is the biggest threat to humanity and also to our future generations. And every citizen on Earth needs to start adopting a sustainable lifestyle. And as an environmentalist who has studied about environmental issues, I feel responsible to fight against climate change and to speak up about it. We really need to assemble and inform every single citizen on Earth regarding the devastating impacts of human-caused climate change. And as I said before, there are many environmental catastrophes which are threatening the world, especially the developing countries like Afghanistan. But at my knowledge, the most pressing global environmental emergency is climate change. So as a responsible citizen of the planet, I really felt concerned about the future of myself, the future of my country, the future of humanity. That's why I became interested to learn more about climate change and to make a difference and to bring about positive change, at least in my society first, and then we can expand it to other countries.
Thank you very much. And I want to come back, in fact, to the situation in Afghanistan, because it too is one of the countries in the world most, certainly most affected by the climate crisis. Let's now hear our final young climate ambassador, dear Celeste. The floor is yours. If you'd also please tell us, what is it that's driving you? And do you feel you're making a difference?
Thank you, Melinda. I'm sensitive to environmental problems since I'm a kid, as I've grown up in a quite polluted and industrial city near Milano, and I've always been suffering being apart from nature. But luckily enough, my family has always brought me to the Alps, and so I've grown up this huge love for nature. And in the time, I always felt this urgency of changing things because I wanted to ensure myself and others also a healthy living in cities. Then in 2018, I ended up in South Africa, in Cape Town, and that year was actually a very tough year for South Africans, as there has been a very long period of drought that has put in crisis the whole economy of the country and mainly the agricultural sector. So I have seen with my eyes all the problems that developing countries actually faces every day. So I went back to Europe with a real need of acting and doing something, and I've taken part to the Climate Reality Project training in Berlin, where I've been trained and formed by Al Gore on climate change problems and solutions. And since then, I've been committing as a climate activist for all these years. Mainly when I came back to Italy, I also felt the urgency of acting at a local level, because changes have to be thought globally, but then acted at a local level. So I had the opportunity to found an association together with some other young friends, which is called Change for Planet. And with this association, we are actually trying to boost a sustainable transition at a local level, engaging communities and local institutions to collaborate and work together for realizing this transition.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Celeste, and thank you to all three of you for sharing those experiences and motivations. Dear Matthias, you got a pretty early start yourself. You were the youngest member of the Bundestag at the time that you were elected as a Green Party member in the early 1990s. So what are your thoughts when you hear our young climate ambassadors? Your own engagement goes back nearly 30 years. Do you think that you and others have made a difference? Are we winning or losing this fight?
I think the jury's out on that one, Melinda, to be very honest. So I look back at the World Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio in 1992, which in a way was the first of these kind of conferences that I really was able to kind of think about, participate from a process perspective. And then 10 years later in Johannesburg, I was at this conference that followed it, back then representing the German government. My hunch is that looking back, we all have underestimated the climate crisis, both in terms of severity as well as in terms of speed. So if you look at the momentum behind the climate emergency today, that's probably the biggest regret that we all should have, that I want to say 30 years ago, we thought this would be a topic that affects more our grandkids, when in reality it affects the people that were already around 30 years ago.
So true. Thank you for that. I'd like to drill deeper now on one of the main goals of COP26, which of course is getting to carbon neutrality and obviously drastically reducing emissions to reach net zero by the middle of the century will be absolutely crucial if we are serious about keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. So if I may begin with you, Celeste, under the so-called European Green Deal, the European Union aims to become climate neutral by 2050. As a representative of the youth of Europe, would you say that's ambitious enough? And what would need to happen to really ramp up and achieve this goal even sooner?
So I have to say that I'm not an expert of this topic, so I will just give my personal perspective on this. Europe has set the deadline for 2050, and probably this might be the most realistic deadline. However, this might not be the most ambitious. We know that carbon neutrality is quite a challenge because it, of course, includes a lot of very complex changes and processes that have to be implemented, and not all countries have the same opportunities and support to actually enable this change to be done. I mean, there are some countries that actually have some vocation for this change to happen because of their economic, their geopolitical or social situation. Indeed, we see that some countries like Finland or Scotland, Austria, Germany actually have set a different deadline, which occurs earlier, some countries in 2035 or 2040. So they might be then an example for other countries as they will set the way for the challenges to actually occur. So what I say is that the first thing to actually help every country to have the same opportunity to make this change happen is collaborating and supporting each other, and also supporting at a financial level. So the global north has to improve this financing opportunity for the global south. So this is the first thing I would say. And then secondly, we have to remember that there is a second mission from the European board, which is reaching 100 cities carbon neutral by 2030. And this is very important because, as we know, cities, even though they cover just 4% of land use, they actually contribute to 65% of energy consumption and 70% of global CO2 emissions. So one first step, which is good, is actually to achieve this first goal of having some cities carbon neutral, so that they can bring an example and be a showcase for other cities to also follow this path. So the starting point is good. We have to be ambitious, but we also have to remember to collaborate and to give equal opportunities to all countries to follow up.
Absolutely. Let me go to Nasratullah. And as I mentioned, I think we'd all like to hear a little bit more about the situation in Afghanistan. According to one recent study, it is one of the 6 countries in the world most drastically affected by climate change. And your country is also in the midst of a powerful political upheaval with the takeover of the Taliban. Are climate change and conflict linked, would you say? And what does that mean, for example, for Afghanistan going forward? Nasratullah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Afghanistan is, of course, one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change, as you mentioned, but unfortunately, it is one of the least equipped to handle the consequences of climate change. There has been relatively little attention paid to climate change in Afghanistan, where the majority of Afghans are farmers or earn income from agriculture. And where the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP, estimates that about 80% of conflict is over land, water, and other resources. And also experts are saying that the warming will further fuel the natural disasters such as drought, floods, landslides, and other extreme events, which will in turn cause mass displacement, conflict, and child marriage. So as a result of climate change, impacts, these issues are said to have worsened. And in Afghanistan, a brutal war has been raging for almost 4 decades. And the link between the climate change and the conflict is very clear, because the impacts of climate change create additional over resources. And also regarding the contribution of Afghanistan, if we talk about Afghanistan is a country that itself has made little contribution to global warming, but it is severely and directly affected by the effects of climate change. And we have already witnessed some adverse effects of climate change in Afghanistan. So on that note, dried up rivers and decades of deforestation, in fact, cause an increasing shortage of arable land in Afghanistan. And as a result of this, further conflict among groups will be provoked, which will be often in a kind of violent competition over land and resources, alongside the existing decades-long conflict, followed by the takeover of the Taliban. Before the COVID-19 crisis and also the takeover of the Taliban, according to the United Nations estimates that I studied a few days ago, 41% of Afghans were directly affected by these land and resource conflict. If we now talk about the environment, climate protection in Afghanistan, like what would it mean? I'm really not that much optimistic about the perspective of the new regime regarding climate change. I really don't think they know much about it, or I don't believe they will give it a priority. And also the limited achievements made by the National Environmental Protection Agency of Afghanistan in past years and other in-line ministries will also go in vain. And I can also project that the climate change impacts will create further humanitarian catastrophes due to floods, drought, poverty, and food and water security. So considering the current situation and the climate change impacts in Afghanistan in the future, we can see that like a future full of humanitarian crises and humanitarian catastrophes is waiting for Afghanistan.
Indeed, and I'm shortly going to quote a few words from the UN's chief climate negotiator, who made exactly that point this week as well, Patricia Espinosa. But let me first go to Aya to get you to weigh in on the situation of Morocco. And of course, Morocco also is a country directly impacted by climate change, as you told us, and with limited resources. And yet, interestingly enough, was 2 years ago at the forefront as one of the very few countries that fulfilled its initial pledges under the Paris Agreement. What are the lessons learned, and what worked for Morocco when it comes to reducing emissions that perhaps could be applied elsewhere, particularly by other developing countries?
Morocco, with the support of several NGOs and intergovernmental organizations, was able to build and update their NDC with ambitious mitigation targets, which are 45.5% below business as usual levels by 2030. So hosting 2 of the climate conferences, including the COP22, which followed the Paris Agreement, has increased governmental and corporate awareness on climate change and allowed the government to take several policies to reduce the emissions. But obviously, it is still not enough and far from the emission reduction targets, including the NDC. Shifting consumers' behaviors towards improved energy efficiency by increasing private investments in low carbon solutions is one of the many actions that are going on and should be accelerated. For instance, the building sector could see major energy savings by adopting policies to scale up distributed renewable energy systems and improve energy efficiency. For example, we have the inauguration of Noor, the greenest and the lowest carbon solar power station, and the first producer of renewable energy in Africa, with the capacity of 582 megawatt hour, is one of the landmark steps the Moroccan government has taken. But it also ranges to other parts in society, such as banning plastic bags, definitely. In addition, the Hassan II Prize of the Environment, which actively motivates scientists to find solutions for the environmental challenges, brought a really interesting idea for London, which was a protocol to reduce the methanol emissions from coals. But currently, we also see rising new stations for desalinized seawater in the south of Morocco, so people could use that water for irrigating their crops. Morocco is also adapting to the harsh conditions caused by climate change, especially in the south. Morocco's experiences cover all parts of society, and its strength is that they look at climate change interdisciplinary. They are bringing together different ministries and partners for policy planning, which has been very valuable for accelerating the implementation of its NDC.
So-called policy coherence and joined up action. Thank you very, very much for sharing that. Matthias, I would be very grateful if you would say a few words about the point that's been emphasized by all three of the young climate ambassadors, namely the fact that the countries that will bear the brunt of global warming are the countries that have done least to cause it. And Celeste said in her remarks that there are, of course, countries in the amongst the Nordics and the European countries that have tried to some degree to be models for others. But in general, would you say that the North, the global North, is doing enough? And do you expect to see them ante up at COP26? Also, in terms of financial support for both mitigation and adaptation in the South?
Yeah, I think that one of the dynamics that I really despise in the run-up for COP26 is that countries and economies that have been at the center of causing climate change are now portraying themselves as climate leaders. So the small island states are climate leaders for me. Costa Rica recently winning the Earthshoot Prize is a climate leader. Morocco, as we just heard, has done a lot in that space. I feel that a bit more humbleness of both the organizing country, the UK, as well as others who are negotiating there would be really helpful. And if I just look at Europe and the United States for a moment, in the United States, the big risk is that the political support for climate action is on very thin ice. Yeah, you have a strong Democratic support, but you have Republicans that don't really believe in the same agenda. And in Europe, it's also on thin ice, because while you have a huge political support for a climate agenda, Europe is not very welcoming for innovation. Those are the two big risks of whatever will be discussed and committed in Glasgow. I'm not sure whether we really see a huge transfer towards the countries that suffer most from climate change. But what I am very sure of is, if we don't get there, if we don't help those communities to be more resilient, those communities will go somewhere else. The refugee crisis, for example, at the so-called Mexican border is in reality a climate crisis. When you look at climate change ravaging Central America, the Syrian refugee crisis was not dissimilar from what we just heard about Afghanistan in terms of the root causes. So my sense is that either countries realize that climate action changes the conditions, or people change the location.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That, in fact, exactly sets up the remarks from Patricia Espinosa that I wanted to bring in here. I'd like all of us to talk a little bit about agriculture in the context of climate change and the COP26. And I thought I would just mention that Patricia Espinosa, who is, of course, the executive secretary of the UNFCCC and therefore the UN's top negotiator, she warned this week that if we do not do our very utmost to slow global warming and become far more ambitious in our goals and actions, that we will face less food, a crisis in food security. And she said that itself will have exactly those follow-on effects that Matthias just described, namely a massive rise in migration and also in conflict. So that said, I'd like to ask all of you, as I said, about this link between agriculture and climate, and I'm going to request very short answers nonetheless, if you would, because we have lots of audience questions coming in, and I do want to get to those as well. So starting, if I may, with Celeste, you are a very strong advocate, we could hear it already, for sustainable agriculture. You've met farmers in many parts of the world. What would you want from a global company and leader in agriculture like Bayer to help reduce emissions in this sector and to support farmers who are going to be coping with the impacts that we're talking about?
So emissions from agriculture have been increasing in the years because of the production. So we have been pushing production more and more, of course, because of demand, but we have left over the environmental protection. So we are now facing a challenge which is not only from the agricultural sector, but from any sectors, which is threatening the ecosystems and the biodiversity. So the agricultural responsibility is not only to become more resilient, but also to actually mitigate climate change and become more friendly towards the ecosystems. So one thing is towards farmers, in major part for smallholder farmers that actually are facing quite strong challenges. So what can Bayer do and other companies do is actually supporting the smallholder farmers in actually becoming more resilient and becoming more strong towards these changes. And enhancing solutions that actually increase biodiversity, that actually support an integration, not only of innovations, but also agroecological practices. And a second thing that we could do is actually help promoting alternative products which actually decrease the impact on the environment, so organic and eco-friendly products. So what Bayer can do is also investing more money on this part of the products.
Thank you very much. Let me go to Matthias and ask him of those things that Celeste just listed off. What is Bayer actually doing? And from your perspective, what is the biggest impact a company like Bayer can have in boosting agricultural resilience?
I believe that the biggest impact we can have is in the space of smallholder farmers. They are the backbone of global nutrition. They played a role already in this discussion. Providing them with access to seeds is going to be one of the crucial contributions because it increases yield, reduces the pressure, for example, to clear more land by way of deforestation. Helping them to deal with the extreme weather events is another very important topic. We talk about water a lot. Irrigation is basically where lots of farmers need support. Water is the one input nobody can really sell. And then the third point I want to make is I believe that those farmers need to get access to nutrients. Be it the phosphate-based fertilizers that are produced in Aya's home country in Morocco, or helping them to convert nitrogen from the air into nutrients for plants through, again, a whole heap of innovations. These are the things we need to do. And then when it comes to the more traditional farming systems, there our contribution has to be to reduce emissions. But again, resilience is high on the agenda because climate change doesn't really make a difference between rich and small farmers.
Absolutely. Aya, let me come back to you and get your response to what you just heard from Matthias, and also get you to weigh in on how you think that countries with environments like Morocco's, the very, very dry, drought-prone countries, can adapt and mitigate the risks of food insecurity due to climate change.
So I think that climate change and food security are challenges which need to be addressed together in order to end hunger. And when we talk about food security, we talk about four main keys. The first of them is the availability. So what Morocco did, and maybe the other countries could get inspired from, is to encourage the local production, the permaculture for smallholder farmers, the guiding concept of climate smart agriculture, are several actions to increase availability. But consumers should also look to themselves. Why not adapt the production to the seasons? Do we really need to have certain fruits all year long in our supermarkets? Why should we force nature? And powdered milk can be a good solution to prevent spoilage of milk, which is currently shipped to the south. This is one of the examples that we should adapt our products to our environment. The second one is access. We should have more small weekly markets with fresh food for a cheaper price, and bring in farmers closer to consumers. This also consumes less energy in comparison with the big supermarkets, which make farmers a distance concept and use substantial amount of resources for transportation and cooling. Then I would move to utilization. Raising awareness about food safety and waste is essential and can be done via all kinds of channels, social media, TV, and newspaper. As Morocco has a daily family TV show that brings people together with our dialect, and they have a part for nutrition. But also in hospitals where doctors give advice to patients, and several labs and offices take care of the food safety. The stability, food reserves should be well maintained and be increased. Emergencies may be on the rise because of climate change, and possible unrest can be prevented by making sure there is enough food. These reserves will be used in case of emergencies, and this is what happened during the pandemic. When people got frustrated at the beginning, they ran to supermarkets and got big quantities of food, while others were afraid to be left with no food. But then the government assured everyone that they have stocks as for emergencies and they could feed everyone. Mm-hmm. After the food security, I would love to talk about nutrition, because people can have access to food, but they would still be undernourished because of the high rate of rainfalls and the bad management of transporting food from their products to the place or the market. It was suggested to adopt composting as a solution for the food that couldn't be consumed, as well as use the organic leftovers, as it makes the good or the best fertilizers. Deficiency of vitamins and high concentration of CO2 decreases the proteins of other oligoelements in our food. That's why our government opted to enrich the basic food with vitamins such as flour, oil, and iodine in salt, since everyone should have access to these important elements that we may be eating every day.
I'm going to stop you there if you don't mind. Thank you very much for that contribution, but I do have an eye on the audience questions coming in, and I want to bring in Nasratullah briefly, if you would, Nasratullah. And by the way, I see that you're having struggles, and we are so grateful to you for working so hard to be part of our discussion. So you have said elsewhere, Nasratullah, that people in Afghanistan often don't understand what climate change is. they may have been hit hard by flooding or drought and by harvest losses and food shortages, but nonetheless, awareness about the causes and effects, you have said, is not fully there. So how can awareness be fostered, and how can that change the behavior of people in countries like Afghanistan? Oh, I think we may have lost him again. Okay,
yeah,
that's a great pity.
like it looks like it.
That's a great pity. Matthias, if you like, weigh in very, very briefly on what we also just heard from Aya, and then we'll go to some of the audience questions that are pouring in.
I think one of the major challenges in the climate change debate that strikes me so much is that even at a 1.5 degree pathway, this is kind of what we would like to see, and we don't see enough action to reach that pathway. We ultimately end up losing 5 to 10% of our food productivity. And what worries me is if we are at 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees, or God forbid 3 degrees, we have a much bigger gap that needs addressing. And in my book, that's probably one of the most underestimated connection of climate change to food systems out there. And we have to work very, very hard to reduce this looming food crisis, which in fact people already kind of experience today with very high food inflation. Currently, 30% higher prices for food imports in countries like Morocco or Nigeria or Syria, of course, create huge challenges in those countries, because you can spend the money only once, either for education or electrification, or for infrastructure in other areas, or for food imports. And this is how climate change is making things much harder. And of course, people won't experience that as much as the food shortages.
Thank you very much. And I see Nasratullah is back with us again. Nasratullah, are you able to hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great.
Really sorry for the inconvenience. It's nighttime and the connection is very unstable.
I know, I see that. And we are so grateful to you for working so hard to be part of the discussion. I just had asked you when you lost the connection last time about the fact that you have said many people in Afghanistan, farmers who have been affected by flooding, by harvest losses, by drought, actually still don't understand in some ways what climate change is. So how can public awareness be raised in a country like Afghanistan, and what would that change about farmers' behavior?
Yeah, that's right. Unfortunately, the environmental issues and also climate change are not a part of the school curriculum at all. And recently, the Ministry of Higher Education decided to add an environmental science subject to all faculties in all universities. We think it's enough. Regarding that, so of course, environmental education needs to be integrated to education system at all levels, starting from primary and secondary to higher education, which is really necessary. And regarding the things that developing countries, especially Afghanistan, will be facing as a result of climate change impacts, and also as a result of not having enough information or knowledge about climate change. So I would say, like, based on my analysis, developing countries, specifically Afghanistan, will be like facing food insecurity in the future. There will be problems with food safety. There will be a rise in diseases, which will be spreading across the region. And in general, it will be affecting the crop production. So we can somehow say that the climate crisis in Afghanistan is affecting all aspects of life, starting from livelihoods of the poor and underprivileged to causing nationwide emergencies and humanitarian crises. So
and Nasratullah,
for like awareness, yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to say that I know you worked for your country's National Environmental Protection Agency, and I wonder whether they did any form of outreach to farmers to try to raise awareness. Is that actually something that's on the political agenda?
Yeah, in the National Environmental Protection Agency, I was specifically working with the ozone unit, and we also had a climate change department, which was specifically working with the Ministry of Agriculture, Irrigation and Livestock, with the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and other ministries in line. They were implementing projects to combat climate change. But I also referred to that before, like these limited achievements will be lost because the current regime doesn't give any priority to climate change. And in terms of the national level, public awareness could be raised through integrating environmental education in the school curriculum, and also giving more momentum to civil societies. There are a limited number of environmental activists, climate activists in Afghanistan, and also a limited number of environmental organizations and associations which are working. So if such organizations are supported by international organizations and other partners, so yeah, using the potential of the young generation, specifically such kind of organizations, which I also had the membership of several of them, and also had the honor to establish a few of them. So yeah, using these strategies, like including the environmental education and the school curriculum, and also using the potential of civil society and also organizations, we can raise awareness.
Thank you very much. And that is a great bridge to a question from audience member Grace Beglan, who asks, how would you all recommend that young people try to get more involved in mitigating climate change, especially, she says, in the UK? So you don't necessarily have to focus on the UK, but perhaps all three of you, from your own experience, Celeste, Aya, Nasratullah, can say a word about how you get people, young people, engaged in this fight. Celeste?
So it has to start, I think, from the local institutions, because it's the closest, channel to start making a change. I just bring over the example of my association. If you're an individual, sometimes it's difficult to be heard from the institutions. So the first step is actually to create a strong connection with other young people, and to start creating something which can be easily just some ideas and suggestions, and then start pointing these things out to the local authorities. By doing this, you can actually create much more efficient and innovative ideas that can actually be implemented then at a local level, and then through the local entities, then you can grow up at a national level. And then this way you can actually start being an example, and also attracting other youth to connect and collaborate with you.
Thank you. Aya?
Yeah, I think that youth should try to connect with institutions, farmers, energy companies, etc. Because youth is not bound to a certain organization yet. We are free and can make collaborations as much as possible. So, for example, with what ES is doing with the VCP, Village Concept Project, we work closely together with farmers, communities, and universities across the globe. We are interdisciplinary working, internationally working, and we foster collaborations. And that is needed for these wicked problems like climate change. So you have to seek collaboration, and we can be the binding factor. So reach out and look at your communities and identify the problems and bring people together.
Thank you very much. And let me get Nasratullah to weigh in on that as well, if you would, please, Nasratullah. Nasratullah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Could you also say a word about how you think young people's voices can be mobilized to really try to make a difference on mitigating climate change? And the person who asked the question is particularly interested in how do you mobilize the voices of the young in, say, a country like the UK?
Well, first of all, I'm sure the basic infrastructure is there. The environmental issues and climate change are included in the curriculum. But what needs to be done is like youth in countries like UK, they should really feel the climate urgency and also the climate crisis. Like, it is not something which will come in the future.
We've lost you for a moment. I think most of us can guess how you would have completed that sentence. It's here right now. Let me, while we're waiting to hopefully get Nasratullah back again, let me bring in another comment from an audience member, which I will turn into a question. The comment is this, and it comes from Ayo Okanlawan. She says, possibly he, I don't know, the effect of climate change on agriculture and food systems in the developing world, and especially Africa, is setting back developmental gains and exacerbating hunger. The world's biggest GHG emitters should do more for the global south. So let me ask all of you, and I'll start with Matthias, what you see as the top priority from the global north, and also from the private sector, Matthias, in terms of how we can support the global south.
The UN Secretary General recently talked about the lingering hunger crisis and basically said, well, we now need to mobilize huge amounts of money to help. And that's absolutely true in an acute crisis. There's no doubt about it. David Beasley was recently really upset. He leads the World Food Program. He actually received the Nobel Peace Prize for his organization. But he was super upset that nobody really seemed to care about 16 million people who starved to death in the midst of the pandemic. So this kind of help is certainly necessary. But my hunch is that it's much more important to provide access to innovation for those countries. And I give you an example that made my day. Kenya this year approved a new variety of cassava that is basically resistant against some viruses. And this new technology will help them to increase food security. Nigeria is the first African country approving a corn variant that is more repellent against insects. These kind of technologies have for a very long time either not been accessible or also as a result of pressure from some countries and organizations in the north, not really been desirable. And we need to unlock all of the technologies of today and more importantly, technologies of tomorrow, so that those countries can modernize the agriculture sectors. To me, this will beat all kinds of help programs big time.
Thank you very much. And let me get Celeste and Aya also to weigh in on this question briefly, if you would.
Yeah, I will be very synthetic. I also agree with Matthias. I think that technological innovation is very important, mainly also for irrigation, so that actually developing countries can use more efficiently water and fertilizers. But also investing in research is very important as a way to find new varieties that actually can stand better the new, changing climate and can support, can actually stand better drought or, other problems like floodings, for example.
Thank you very much. And I'll just mention that Bayer and Matthias has let us know this before in LinkedIn talks, that Bayer in fact has a research budget that greatly exceeds the R&D budgets of many, many countries. So Aya, if you would also just say a word about what you would expect and hope for from the Global North, what you think is most crucial.
I think this is for the UN in general, because I never understood why is no poverty the first sustainable development goal instead of zero hunger, because everyone wishes to be fed and stay alive than not be poor. And I remember a few years ago, Moroccans were a bit angry because Italy was trying to buy their portion of NDC so they could take their trash to Morocco, and this was a bit chaotic. So maybe creating such rules is creating a conflict between countries, so as not to have trash in yours, you buy one from the southern countries. So we suffer from the climate change because we don't produce many trash and we don't waste food, and then we have countries from the north wanting to pollute our countries even more. So making such rules is good for the environment, but we have to look at them because they don't always work as we think they would.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I have a question that's come in for you, Matthias, from Thomas Westhoff. And he says, how are we making sure that actions to reach set goals like net zero are made on time? Unpopular decisions are often delayed by policymakers and by industry.
I'm very happy that there are close to 1,000 companies being part of the Science-Based Target Initiative across the food value chain, for example, starting with Walmart, going all the way down to farmers, and of course also companies like Bayer, who basically make commitments to science-based target, and they have to document that they're actually delivering the absolute reductions. So we need to have these kind of frameworks. Before we even think about programs like carbon offsetting, we need to reduce our emissions along the line of the path that was defined in Paris to reach 1.5 degrees. I think that accountants will be the real heroes of this transformation because they document whether you deliver or not. Many companies currently worry about, oh, what is my carbon emission in 2050? To be honest, I spent the better part of this year making sure that Bayer reduces their emissions by 5% in 2021, because that's what we actually committed to do. The 2050 or 40 or 30 discussions often steer away energy from actually doing it as we speak.
And in fact, one of our LinkedIn Live talks also addressed the idea of how we measure and hold companies accountable for their so-called ESG factors, their environmental, social, and governance achievements that many put forward, but don't always perhaps have the means to measure to the degree that that is necessary. So let me now, with just very short time left, ask all of you for a few closing words. And looking toward the COP26, which of course does get underway next week, I'd like to know from all four of you, in one sentence, if you would, what is your expectation for this make or break meeting? And what would you consider a success? What will you be watching for either when you go there or when you're watching from further away? And let me see whether, because I at least see Nasratullah is with us. Nasratullah, can you hear us? We'd love to hear from you if you can.
Yeah, I can hear you. So I would like to
okay,
give my
then you get to say two things.
I lose the connection again.
Yeah, no problem. You get to speak to that point, but also very briefly, if you would, your main ask from the Global North. What would you most want to see the Global North deliver, and what are your expectations for the COP?
So I want the Global North to really help the developing countries, the ones like Afghanistan, the ones like in Africa, because they really cannot do it on their own. They need the financial support and also technical support of other countries. Like they shouldn't expect those countries to do something by their own. Secondly, they should not neglect, because I know there are many countries across the globe which are neglected in the climate change agenda. So such countries should be given priority. And regarding the hope for the COP, yeah, I really hope that it would be a fair and inclusive COP where the voices of all nations are heard. The voice of all nations is heard, starting from Afghanistan to the poorest countries in Africa and other parts of the world. And also, I hope in this COP, the world leaders like come to concrete decisions and take action, and not just give empty promises. And we will wait for another COP27, and then again the same empty promises will continue. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much. Celeste, one sentence if you would. We're out of time.
I would just say I really want to see developed countries to take responsibility. That's it.
To take responsibility. Thank you very much. Aya.
I would say action. We have had many movies, documentaries calling for action. Now it's time to see the actions coming.
Matthias, do you go to Glasgow with a sense of optimism, and what are your expectations?
Yeah, I'm a climate optimist. I think in this whole debate with everything we're seeing, if we don't have like a healthy dose of optimism, it's going to be difficult. And I'm with Aya. I'd like to see action related to 5 C's: to coal, to cars, to concrete, to chemistry, and last but not least, regarding cattle. Those are the 5 areas where I would like to see change.
Thank you very, very much for that. Also for those concrete examples. That gives all of us something to keep our eyes on as the COP gets underway. And I just would like to say the very warmest thanks to Celeste, to Nasratullah, to Aya for being with us, and also for all that you're doing and will be doing at the COP to try to follow through on the calls for action that you have given here in our discussion. And many thanks, of course, to Bayer for making this discussion possible, to Matthias for taking part once again, always a pleasure, and as well to the whole organizational team behind the scenes that has been working so hard, not least to try to keep Nasratullah with us online. And to you, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your participation, for your attention, and for your comments and questions. I wish all of you well and hope to see you again soon at the next Bayer LinkedIn Live talk. Until then, stay healthy. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.